All right, hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring something, kind of unique. We're diving into the world of yoga,
Yoga.
but not necessarily the kind you might be picturing, with the yoga pants and the mats and all that.
Right, right.
We're going beyond, like way beyond the physical practice, and
Yeah.
we're going deep, deep into the philosophy behind it, and
hmm
specifically
Yeah,
how it all intersects with Christianity.
exactly. Yeah. And the book that we're going to be using as our guide for this deep dive is called Debunking Yoga Philosophy, A Christian Response,
Hmm.
written by Samuel James. So it's a really, really fascinating exploration of how these two worldviews, yoga and Christianity, how they kind of bump up against each other.
Yeah, it's like, imagine you're trying to climb two mountains, right?
Yeah.
And one mountain is the path of yoga and the other mountain is the path of Christianity. And they both kind of involve like this yearning for something bigger than yourself, right? This like desire for connection with something more.
Mhm.
But what if like those paths lead to totally different summits? Like what if they're not even on the same mountain range?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And that's what the book really gets at, is that they're both concerned with this idea of spiritual growth, this
Yeah.
kind of upward trajectory. But the foundations of each of these systems of belief, I guess you could say, or worldviews, is that they're so vastly different. So
Yeah.
they might look similar at times, but they're really coming from very, very different places.
So let's start with yoga. I think a lot of people are familiar with some of the terms. Maybe they've even dabbled in some of the practices. But this book really dives deep into concepts like samsara, karma, and moksha. Have you ever, felt stuck in a rut, like going through the same cycles over and over again? Like that's kind of what samsara represents in yoga, right? Like this continuous cycle of reincarnation that's kind of fueled by like the consequences of your actions, like what you do matters.
Exactly. And that's where karma comes in, this idea that your actions have consequences,
Yeah.
not just in this life, but potentially in past lives and future lives as well.
Yeah.
So it's a very interconnected web of cause and effect.
Yeah.
And the goal, of course, in yoga is to break free from that cycle,
Yeah.
to reach a state of liberation called moksha.
Moksha, yeah. Okay, so I can already kind of see how that could clash with some Christian beliefs.
Yeah, you can see the seeds of potential conflict there.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we get too far into the conflict, let's unpack some more of those core yoga concepts because I think it's helpful to kind of have a foundation, right?
Definitely, yeah.
The book spends a lot of time on Atman and Brahman, and I gotta admit, even for me, this Atman thing, kind of a mind bender. So help us break this down.
Okay, so Atman, think of it as like the individual self, right? So like the spark of consciousness that's within each one of us.
Okay.
And then Brahman, that's like the ultimate reality, the source from which everything flows. It's kind of like the ground of all being, you could
Yeah,
say.
okay.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. In Advaita Vedanta, which is like a prominent school of Hindu philosophy,
Mm.
they say that Atman and Brahman are actually one and the same.
Wait a minute, so like I'm God.
That's the idea.
Whoa.
It's this concept of non-duality.
Okay.
There's no separation.
So that's pretty different from like the Christian idea of God as like the creator and then like creation is separate.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. In the Christian worldview, you have this very clear distinction between God and humanity. And this is where you start to see, how these worldviews really diverge.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the book also mentions these things called klishas, which I don't think I've ever heard of before. What are those?
So imagine like obstacles or distractions that cloud your true understanding. Things that keep you kind of stuck in that hamster wheel of samsara.
Oh.
Those are the kleshas. And they include things like ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and even like the fear of death.
So kind of like temptations in a way.
Yeah, you could think of them that way. Things that
But
kind of, pull you off the path.
right, they kind of lead you astray. Okay, so then yoga, of course, offers the solution, right?
Yeah.
And the book goes into like this famous eightfold path that a lot of people, they see it represented by the yoga poses.
Right. Yeah. Those images of the yogis and the different postures.
Right, exactly. But
Yeah.
it's way more than just the poses. It's like it's a whole system.
It's a whole system for training the mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all geared towards ultimately achieving that state of moksha.
Okay.
Now, there are 8 limbs in total, but I think some key ones to highlight are the yamas, which are like ethical restraints, and the niyamas, which are observances. So essentially, it's about cultivating virtuous behavior.
Okay, so that sounds like something Christianity would totally be on board with, right? Like be a good person.
On the surface, yes, right? Both traditions value ethical behavior, right? Being a good person.
Yeah.
But I think the motivation and the ultimate goal are quite different.
Okay.
So in yoga, the yamas and niyamas are seen as steps towards purifying the mind and body so that you can ultimately achieve liberation from samsara.
Mm.
But in Christianity, ethics are rooted in love.
Okay.
Love for God and love for neighbor.
Oh, I see.
And that flows from a relationship with Jesus.
So even though there's like similarities, it's coming from like a different source or a different wellspring.
Exactly. And it's aimed at a different destination, you could say.
Okay. And speaking of different, like let's talk about how this book really kind of tackles some of the core differences between yoga and Christianity head on.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't shy away from the controversy.
Yeah.
It calls out what it sees as logical inconsistencies in yoga philosophy and challenges some of its fundamental principles.
Hmm.
For example, one of the things that it brings up is like, how can a finite mind ever truly experience moksha,
Right.
which is supposed to be infinite and boundless?
It seems like a paradox.
It does, right?
And then what about reincarnation? I mean, the book points out like we don't even remember our past lives, right?
That's one of the sticking points. Like,
Yeah.
if we're carrying over these experiences and desires from past lives, why don't we remember them?
Right.
And, going even deeper, the book questions, like, the whole logic of Samkhya, which is a school of thought that sees the soul as trapped in matter. And the author asks, well, if the soul is inherently pure, then why would it get entangled with the material world in the first place?
So he's kind of calling out some pretty like fundamental things about like the whole foundation of it.
Exactly.
And it sounds like he's not buying into like the whole supernatural powers thing either, right? Like the CDs.
Right, yeah. That often comes up in discussions of yoga, and the book kind of dismisses that as pseudoscience.
Okay.
But I am curious, have you ever experienced anything like personally that's made you wonder if maybe there's more to this than meets the eye?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure, but I definitely think it's a topic that like sparks debate, you know?
For sure, yeah. And it's important to acknowledge that a lot of people experience real benefits from the practice of yoga, physically and mentally.
Oh, absolutely. Yoga can be incredibly helpful for like stress reduction, flexibility, overall well-being, right?
Yeah.
But as we're discussing, you can't really separate the practice from the philosophy,
No.
even if you're not like actively thinking about, at Spawn and Brahman when you're doing downward dog. Like,
Yeah.
those ideas are still kind of embedded there in the tradition.
Woven into the fabric of it.
Mhm.
So it raises the question, can you embrace the benefits of yoga without subscribing to the underlying worldview?
Yeah, that's something for everyone listening to ponder. Okay, well, speaking of pondering, let's dive into like the heart of the matter here. Like, where does Christianity specifically disagree with yoga? Like, what are the big points of contention?
Yeah, let's get into that. I think it really boils down to the foundation of these belief systems. They have different sacred texts, different understandings of God, and different paths to salvation.
So let's start with like the scriptures,
Okay.
right? I know yoga draws from texts like the Vedas and the Upanishads.
Mm-hmm.
How do those compare to like the Bible?
Well, they offer, I guess you could say, completely different lenses through which to view the world.
Yeah.
The Vedas and Upanishads, they emphasize this interconnectedness of all things, the idea that we're all part of this universal consciousness, this Brahman.
Okay.
The Bible, on the other hand, presents a very different a narrative of creation, fall, and redemption, with a personal God who is distinct from his creation.
Okay, so right from the start, we're dealing with very different starting points, like totally different ways of even understanding like the nature of reality. And I imagine that shapes their views on God as well, right?
Absolutely. And, yoga actually has a very diverse view of the divine. You have the personal Ishvara in Bhakti Yoga, where the emphasis is on devotion to a personal God. But then you have the impersonal Brahman in Advaita Vedanta, which is this ultimate reality that's beyond form and definition. Christianity, on the other hand, is strictly monotheistic, right? One God existing in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Wow. So even like their conceptions of God are like fundamentally different. Okay, and what about like salvation? How does that concept compare?
Yeah, well, in yoga, the goal is moksha, right? Liberation from that cycle of samsara that we talked about earlier. And it's about realizing your true nature as divine, merging with that ultimate reality. In Christianity, salvation is about being reconciled with God through faith in Jesus Christ. It's not something you earn. It's a gift of grace received through faith.
So two very different paths to two very different destinations.
Okay, so I'm guessing their ethical frameworks differ too, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the yamas and the niyamas earlier. How do those compare to Christian ethics?
Right. So, as we mentioned, both systems emphasize ethical behavior, but their motivations are different. In yoga, the yamas and niyamas are seen as tools for purification, as steps on the path towards moksha. Christian ethics, though, are grounded in love for God and love for neighbor, and that flows from, a transformed heart, a heart that's been changed by the grace of God.
Yeah, okay, so even though both encourage, yoga and Christianity encourage being a good person, the underlying why is different. Okay, so I know a lot of our listeners might be thinking, but I just do yoga for the workout. What's the big deal?
Yeah.
Does the book address this more modern, like fitness-focused approach to yoga?
It does, yeah. The author actually talks about how yoga has evolved, particularly in the West, and he distinguishes between what he calls commercial yoga and New Age yoga.
So commercial yoga is what you often see in gyms and studios. The emphasis there is on physical fitness, stress reduction, flexibility. The spiritual dimension is often like downplayed or stripped away entirely.
Right, it's more about like, yoga pants and smoothie bowls than like deep philosophical ponderings.
Exactly. But then you have New Age yoga, which blends in practices like astrology, crystal healing, and, other esoteric traditions. And it tends to be much more individualized, kind of like a pick and choose approach to spirituality.
And the book expresses some concerns about these forms of yoga.
Yeah, it raises the issue of cultural appropriation, particularly with commercial yoga. The concern is that these ancient practices are being commodified and divorced from their original context.
Right, it's like taking something that was once sacred and turning it into a trendy commodity. And what about like the ethical implications of New Age yoga?
Well, the book suggests that blending practices from different traditions without a deep understanding of their meaning can be problematic.
Mm.
It's important to approach these things with respect and sensitivity.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like there's a lot more to consider here than just stretching and breathing. This deep dive is really making me think about what I'm engaging with and like where these practices originated.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point. This book is challenging us to think critically about yoga, to understand what we're really getting into beyond just the physical practice.
So, if the underlying philosophy of yoga is incompatible with Christianity, does that mean Christians should like steer clear of it altogether? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
That's the million-dollar question. And the book doesn't offer a simple answer. It encourages readers to really grapple with these differences and decide what resonates with their own beliefs and values.
Okay, so no easy answers.
Right.
But I appreciate that honesty, I think. It's about being informed and making like a conscious choice.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to spirituality. What works for one person might not work for another. The key is to be mindful and intentional in our choices.
Okay, so for those listeners who find themselves drawn to both yoga and Christianity, what advice would you give them as they navigate these, like, seemingly contrasting paths?
Well, I think the first step is to really understand the core principles of both traditions. What are their fundamental beliefs? Where do they align and where do they diverge? Once you have a clear understanding of those differences, you can start to discern what resonates with your heart and your conscience.
So it's about doing the inner work, the self-reflection. It's not just about, like, blindly following a practice, but really understanding what you're getting into.
Exactly. And if you find yourself wrestling with those differences, don't be afraid to seek guidance from, trusted spiritual mentors or engage in open and honest conversations with people who hold different perspectives.
Right. Those conversations can be so enriching. Even if you don't come to the same conclusions, just like the process of dialogue and respectful debate, I think, can deepen your own understanding.
I completely agree. Iron sharpens iron, as they say. Now remember, what we've explored today is just one perspective on a complex topic. There are many faces and interpretations out there.
Right. And that's the beauty of a deep dive like this, right? It's a jumping off point for further exploration and reflection.
So listener, we leave you with this. If you find value in both yoga practice and your Christian faith, how might you reconcile these seemingly contrasting paths? Is it even possible? Or are they destined to remain separate journeys? That's something for you to ponder.
Wow, that's a really powerful question to leave our listeners with. This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I hope it's given our listeners plenty to chew on. And remember, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Wow, what a journey, huh? We really went deep into the heart of yoga philosophy and how it relates to Christianity.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
We did. So listener, what really stood out to you from everything we talked about today?
Well, we started by unpacking those core yoga concepts, right? Like samsara and moksha. That deep desire to break free from the cycle of birth and death, all tied to the idea of karma.
Right, and then things got really interesting when we started comparing those ideas with, like, core Christian beliefs.
Yeah, we dove into the different scriptures that form the foundation of these traditions, the Vedas and the Upanishads for yoga and the Bible for Christianity. And we saw how those texts offer totally different perspectives on, like, the nature of reality itself, the nature of God, and even how we achieve salvation.
And we even explored how those different foundations, like those different starting points, lead to different views on ethical behavior.
Right, like we talked about in yoga, it's about purification and reaching moksha. But in Christianity, it's about love, love for God and for your neighbor.
And it wasn't just ancient philosophy either. We explored how yoga has evolved in modern times with commercial yoga and New Age yoga.
Yeah, and that's where some of those ethical concerns and that idea of cultural appropriation come into play, as the book highlighted.
Right. Okay, so the big question that's kind of been lingering in my mind this whole time, if yoga and Christianity are ultimately rooted in such different worldviews, can someone truly embrace both? Like, what are your thoughts on that, listener?
Well, I think the book makes it clear there isn't a simple, easy answer. It really challenges us to do some deep thinking, some soul searching, and figure out what feels right for us based on our own values and beliefs.
It's such a powerful message. It's not about just going through the motions with some practice, but about making like intentional choices, being informed.
Absolutely. And, it's okay if your choices lead you down a different path than someone else's.
Hmm.
I think the beautiful thing about spirituality is that it's a deeply personal journey.
Well said. What really strikes me after this whole deep dive is the reminder that even something that seems as straightforward as yoga has all these layers of complexity. It's not just about the physical poses, but about a whole way of looking at the world, understanding ourselves and our place in the universe.
I totally agree. And that's such a valuable thing to remember as we, navigate the world, whether we're stepping onto a yoga mat or exploring any other spiritual practice or belief system. It's about being curious and open, but also being discerning.
Right. It's about asking those tough questions like, okay, what are the underlying assumptions here?
Mm.
Where did this practice come from? Does it actually align with my own values?
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. The book we explored, Debunking Yoga Philosophy, A Christian Response, it offers a really valuable critique. But it's important to remember, it's just one perspective.
Right. There are so many other voices and interpretations out there. Hopefully, our conversation today has given you, the listener, some food for thought, a starting point for your own exploration.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep, listener. And that's it for this deep dive. See you next time.
See you.